Welcome to Serious Talk Agentic AI. I'm your host, Greg Banks. Thanks for joining us today. Here's a number that got my attention. Running one industry benchmark suite end-to-end costs $5,455 on one frontier model and just over $2,000 on the other. Same test, wildly different bill. Tim Harding, our COO, and Gavin Franklin, our head of custom development, are back to break down the model lineups and pricing from Anthropic and OpenAI, the two labs that carry at least 80% of enterprise usage today. We get practical about the four-tier model ladder, which tier fits which task, what your $20 a month actually buys from each lab, when subscription pricing beats usage-based, and how plugins and admin settings keep a whole team on the right model without burning the budget. This is going to be a good one. Let's get into it. Welcome to Serious Talk Agentic AI. Tim and Gavin, good to see you guys again.
Yeah, good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
This is going to be a fun episode. As I looked over the chronology of the last year, there's been two major themes to watch. One was just finding out features and models. Which one can you actually solve the problems you're wanting to solve with? And the other is, how do you pay for it? The models have certainly changed. And I think as they've got out there and got the feature set right, they've got the right clients embedded, if you will, or buying in. Now they can start playing around with the numbers and do whatever they want to do with them. So that's what companies do, right? That's capitalism. But Tim, you've brought up several times as we talk through this. At the end of the day, you can get all the outputs in the world out of this, but if the costs exceed the benefits, what did you actually solve here? Right? We can be very efficient at going out of business if you don't really keep your eye on the ball, so to speak. So we thought it'd be a good time to bring this topic back up and do a review. There certainly are more than two models. We're going to take a look at a couple of them. But Tim, why don't you set the table with where we're going to go with the comparison today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think most weeks on the show with episodes that we've had, we're obviously focusing on agentic harnesses and agentic loops, context management, things around building agents. What we haven't covered in a while, what's underlying every single agentic harness is a large language model. So it's really key. I mean, it is literally the foundation in the key technology that's driving everything else with agents. So the decision of what large language model you're going to use and what plan or subscription you're going to settle on for your agents that you're building is very foundational and very, very key. So thought it was long overdue to have a discussion around this because it's a space like anything else in AI right now that's consistently changing. I would say one of the main things that's happened over the summer is just the amount of LLMs that are near frontier level has changed as well. Even last year, very early, this year was primarily just the three big labs, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, with where certain releases and stuff are right now. Google's maybe fallen behind on a few of the benchmarks. Anthropic, OpenAI is still at the forefront on the frontier side, but then you've got a lot right near them in the pack. However, we're going to focus on Anthropic and OpenAI here today because, one, they still are the two leaders, and two, from an enterprise perspective, at least 80% of enterprise usage right now is running through models through these two labs. So rather than diluting the ocean with a lot of different comparisons, we'll do a comparison of OpenAI models from the OpenAI lab versus Anthropic models from the Anthropic lab, and really use this as a way to help you think through what are some of the key things, either as a small business or a mid-commercial business or an enterprise business. What are some of the key things you got to think through evaluating what foundation to build your agentic harnesses on? So yeah, I think outside of that, really excited to dive in today. Gavin, any thoughts from your end, or where do you want to start?
Yeah, so I'll just say before we dive in, it's important to understand that models and the payment for the models is different, right? So the plans that you have with these vendors is different than what models you necessarily have access to. Some models are gated behind certain plans, but for the most part, you're going to have the capability to choose any model for a task. So we're going to be comparing both the models to understand what those models are used for. And then we're going to be comparing the subscriptions and how you can then interact with the vendors to get access to those models and what type of payment you'd have to do. So at the end of the day, I think the good place to start is just understanding that you have two companies, Anthropic, OpenAI. Things are ever changing so rapidly, more so than I've ever seen a lot of the competitive space change. We're constantly having to adjust our strategy internally based off of some of the offerings that they have. But at the same time, you'll also see that majority of decisions that these companies make are in lockstep with each other. And each of the models that we're going to talk about today typically have a model adjacent to in the other company. So in reality, what you're looking at with models is not which company has the right model for the job, because both of them probably have one that fit it. but rather which model within those companies is going to be good for the task or the prompt that I'm using at this time to complete some action that I want. And really, that's going to range from what level of effort are we talking about here for that task to be completed? Anywhere from low to the maximum frontier models that we see today of what might need to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And what is effort really even looking at? Because I think a lot of people see effort and then they see models and they're like, okay, what's the point? Why even have effort? It's like another dial on top of picking the model. So what are some key differences or things that people have to keep in mind of when you're evaluating dialing effort versus the model?
Yeah. So when we talk about effort, it's really from something low end to high end. If I talk low end, it's really something that's I've got one piece of input or a small amount of input, and I just need to make some assumptions based off of that input in order to provide output. So this could be something like email summarization, assistance with email writing. So typically the context window that model has to look at is very small. And I think context really is in line with the layers of effort that you need, context and complexity of the task, right? So I think those two pieces are really what drives up effort when you think about the task that you need to work on. So then you get into effort, which is where you start to see something like coding, right? Because now the complexity of the task increases, and so typically does the context being provided in order to complete that complexity. You're going to need to pick out essentially an existing code within that code base that may be relevant to the code that you want the agent to write. And then you get even into more frontier leading edge models, which are taking advantage of sub-agents, routing capabilities. So there are also capabilities that some models have over some of the lower ones that allow it to basically break complex tasks, long-running complex tasks, into smaller, maybe lower effort tasks one by one, which is really going to be a big breakthrough in being able to utilize frontier models and break it into smaller chunks.
That makes sense. Yeah. And I think it's useful to have that dial, but it also adds this whole other layer of complexity when you're thinking of like what to control. So something to definitely keep in mind there. All right. I think moving next, we put some thought into like a logic depth ladder. So in terms of like thinking in terms of models, what each family actually has and what the costs are of those models. Now, this is, as of right now, August 25th, 2026. So these are the models we have right now. You got new models coming out every week or so. But maybe let's break down what the tiers are between Anthropic, OpenAI. What are the costs within each tier for each of their respective frontier models? And kind of what are some key takeaways here when you're looking at the lineup on both sides?
Yeah. So I think it's important to know before we jump into this that first, when we talk about the models, typically what we see is both Anthropic and OpenAI have what we consider a model family, right? So Anthropic today is Claude 5, OpenAI is ChatGPT 5.6, and each of them have submodels within that. So all of the releases that they do are coming out under that category. Additionally, when we talk about cost, we're talking about cost per million tokens when using that model. It's an interesting concept when we have conversations with some of our clients. What's the cost of running this task? The question a lot of times is, well, what model? Because it's not just cost per 5 million tokens. It's also dependent upon what model you're using, because there's a token bucket essentially for each model. So definitely a lot of variables when it comes to cost. And like Tim was saying, this is changing so quickly. This is August 2026, right? So who knows? Listening to our podcast in a year, these numbers are going to be completely different. But when we look at the tiers, essentially when we think about tier 1, we look at, on the Anthropic side, a Haiku, and on the OpenAI side, Luna. And typically these are for some things that I was mentioning earlier, low effort items. So classification of things, simple chat. Like if you're just chatting back and forth between an AI, this is going to probably leverage Haiku, drafting an email, summarization, cheap, quick automation items. That's typically what we see there. And then tier 2, which is going into more productive items, is where you see your Sonnet 5 and your Terra model, respectively, within Anthropic and OpenAI. And this is where you start to get to adaptive thinking. So it's the idea of I provided an input and there's some reasoning behind the decision on what the model does, right? So you wouldn't necessarily want to leave that to a little model like Haiku or Luna. You'd maybe want to give them smaller subtasks. But with Sonnet and Terra, it can be a little bit of a reasoning engine in deciding, okay, I might need to go and reach out to Salesforce to populate some data, or I might need to go and update a cop somewhere, some of the things that we've talked about. And you see some intelligence involved in this, and additionally some internal tools being supported within these models. Then you get to tier 3, and this is where we see Opus 5 and Sol, respectively, for Anthropic and OpenAI. And this is essentially where you start to leverage things like coding. These are the types of models that were being deployed to code bases to help build out large-scale code bases for enterprise clients. They're pulling in a lot of context. You could see these models also running for very large running tasks. Maybe you have some scheduled tasks that you need to pull a bunch of different context in and then make decisions about what to do with that context. This is typically the model that you're going to see, and maybe it even breaks it down into smaller agentic chunks with lower models at that point. And then finally, you get to tier 4, which is really your frontier models. And this is really just where you get to really immense agentic orchestration, a lot of reasoning, sub-agents. And that's with Anthropic's Fable 5 and OpenAI's Sol Pro or Sol Ultra is what they're calling it right now. So with that, you're looking at the more frontier models. And over the next few months, we expect there's going to be a new frontier model that appears within each of the companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting too is there's another layer to this too, is the data retention policies with each model as well. So I think Fable 5, and this has been a big piece with enterprises. If you opt out of data retention with your plan for some of the lower levels, there's a different data retention. There's not a zero data retention policy for Fable 5 at the highest frontier model as well. So that's another piece to look at, is like, what are the different policies for each level? And that might start to vary more over time because adoption of Fable 5 at the enterprise level has been slower specifically because of that. And then finally, the piece that's somewhat on here too is just model speed. Speed is a big piece too in terms of the type of work you need to do and how productive you're going to be. It might be cheaper for that task, but if you're also moving faster, you're going to get more tasks done in that amount of time. So you're just going to be doing more turns. So there's all these different levers or dials that you're looking at when you're comparing.
Yeah, additionally, context windows as well vary for each of the models. So the larger models are going to allow higher context windows, which then affects speed as well, just more to evaluate.
Right. So the next piece we're going to look at here, I think is pretty interesting, is looking at specifically, like, what are you getting with each specific tier? So, I mean, a lot of people look at the models, and I think a lot of people know the general models because they see them available whenever they use ChatGPT or they use Claude. They can see, oh, I can select from these options. But what's not as clear is, yes, everybody has a $100 tier option, or everybody has a $20 a month option. But how much bang for your buck are you actually getting with that subscription tier from that provider? And I think that's something that hasn't really been covered quite as much as some of these other topics that we've talked about, but is really, really key. Like, are you really comparing apples to apples if you look at OpenAI's $20 a month versus Anthropic's $20 a month, for example? So maybe let's dive into subscription tiers. And at the end of the day, what is it that you actually get with the different tiers between Anthropic and OpenAI?
Yeah, absolutely. So with subscription tiers, I tend to break them into 2 separate categories. I think you have what I consider a personal tier, and then a team tier and an enterprise tier. And there are many layers within that we're going to dive into. But there's essentially, if you're working solo on a project and you're leveraging Anthropic or OpenAI, that's when you want to try to determine what type of subscription personal tier makes sense for me. So everybody in the world has access to the basic free tiers for both Anthropic and OpenAI. You can go to Claude.ai, you can go to ChatGPT and go and ask questions. And really what that is it's going to be the lowest models that they have running. A lot of them have capabilities like generating code in the web application, but they can work within small context. But typically what you're going to see is you're providing every possible thing that it could need right there in the prompt within the web page. Then ChatGPT offers a little bit of an intro tier with Go, Doesn't really have an equivalent on Anthropic. So this is just a $8 a month right now. You can basically get a little bit of a higher cap and access to the next tier, the 𝗙𝗪 tier level of AI. So it gives you a little bit of an entry, $8 a month piece there to work with. And then you start working into a flagship personal tier, which is the Pro plan, right? So this is when you start getting access to things like Claude Code. You get access to some of the flagship models. And then with OpenAI, you get access to Codex. You get access to deep research. You get access to Sol, which is what's generating a lot of the code today, Sol and some of the higher tiers of Claude Code. And then you start moving into the really high personal tiers. And for Anthropic, this mirrors a lot of what they have available for companies. But you get into Max and Max Pro. So basically that's saying now I'm going to pay for a credit pool each month. And so you're paying $100 or $200 a month, and you're getting access to a certain number of tokens, certain number of credits. Now, those credits are calculated based off the token in the model that's being utilized, but it's a subscription-based package, and it allows you to utilize basically everything that you have within the Pro plan, but you can just utilize it more based off of which max tier you're on. And then on the OpenAI side, you do have Pro at an $100 cost or at a $200 cost, which is essentially exactly like what you would see with Anthropic's. So it's just credit of usage and the amount of context you're allowed to pull in. All of those things are going to increase as you go into the tiers. And then you get into the business side. So once you start to where you have multiple users under one account, you want to operate within a business, this is where things really start to differ between Anthropic and OpenAI models. So Anthropic essentially has two different tiers at the team plan. You have your standard and then your max plan. So that could cost you anywhere from $25 to $125 per seat. And what that's adjusting is the amount of credits that you get each month. And really, it's credits within a 5-hour window. It's not each month. It's a 5-hour window of credits. It's going to increase drastically if you go to that 125 range. And that's seat-based up to 150 people. Then you go on to the OpenAI side, and they don't really have the concept of a premium plan. So it's really just $20 to $25 a month, and you're going to be paying for a smaller usage. But then the way you interact with OpenAI is you basically deposit an amount for that team, and everyone shares that usage pool. So that usage pool is being pulled for the teams. And then lastly, you get into the enterprise levels. And the enterprise levels between OpenAI and Anthropic are much more, I would say, tight-knit in what they're advertising, right? This is very much so more of a negotiation between the business and the LLM provider. But typically what you're going to see with OpenAI is you're going to have around 150 people minimum per seat. So you still are paying seat-based, but then you're also doing a shared credit pool. And so it's a little bit of a hybrid. And then on the Anthropic side, you typically see about $20 per seat, and then it's all usage based from there. So every time you go to use something, you're paying for it out of usage compared to a subscription model that they advertise with the team plan. The enterprise is more usage based for both OpenAI and Anthropic.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see that type of breakdown. And there's a whole other layer, I think a really cool website to go take a look at. They've done a lot of work on too, is I think looking at subscriptions is one really good layer to look at, like how much am I actually getting with this subscription? But then artificial analysis is an organization that's done a lot of work on looking at like, what does it actually cost to run and get work done with models? So they've come up with some benchmarks around costs per task, along with costs to actually run like different indexing benchmarks. And so it really gives like a real life look at, okay, great, here's the reasoning benchmarks, here's like the printed costs of these, but what does this actually relate or result in with real life usage? And so I think that's just a whole other layer to make sure you're factoring in when you're looking at this as well, because there's a pretty sizable gap, specifically with GPT-5.6 Sol as being quite a bit cheaper to run on a cost per task rate than compared to some of the Anthropic competitors. So just another layer to look at here. So I mean, Anthropic, you're getting a lot with your subscription plan. If you can fit into that subscription plan, you're getting a lot of usage there compared to the other options like OpenAI. But if you're not able to maybe fit into that plan option, if you have more than 150 users or you have to go usage-based, that's where I think I would really look heavily at the cost per task, not just the printed costs as well. And that's where I think right now, like GPT-5.6 Sol, Luna, and a couple of the other most recent GPT models, they're really leaning into the narrative, and it's part of their goals of, hey, we're just a more efficient model to run. We're going to do less turns. We're going to go get this done and do real world work for you for cheaper. So two sides of the same coin. If you can fit in the subscription, you get a lot with Anthropic. If you don't fit in a subscription tier and you have to go usage based, I'd look pretty heavily at the cost per task and the real life cost to run the models as well, because I think that is really the main thing you got to look at in that case.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. Essentially, if you look at it pure from, let's say, API usage, if you were just going to hit these models via API, pretty much across the board, you're going to see Anthropic being more expensive per million tokens on any one of their relevant models. So if you're going just a usage-based route, you want to go with the tool that is forcing efficiency. And we see that a lot with OpenAI's models. They're trying to bring the overall run cost down. Where Anthropic really wins out is in that small, medium-sized business world where they're offering subscription plans that are predictable in pricing and can typically coverage most heavy use of their tools for their teams. And that's really where we see, okay, we have predictable pricing. We don't have to just throw money into a pool every month and hope that it covers it and then have to have an awkward conversation at the end of the month when it doesn't. That's where we see the trade-offs.
Yeah. Yeah, just looking at artificial analysis benchmarks right now as of today, and these are updated live on their site. So you have cost per intelligence index task. And I think this is only one piece to look at, one number to look at, because higher reasoning models can do more complex tasks. But per reasoning task, they have Claude Fable 5 is actually listed at $3.14 cost per intelligence task. A Claude Opus 5 Max, for example, is at $2.34. Compare that to GPT 5.6 Sol on max setting. It's 96 cents cost per intelligence task, so less than a third of the cost. But then another really interesting number that they run, again, you can go look up artificial analysis on their website. They update these live. A really interesting piece too is the cost to run the full intelligence index. So they have their benchmark, they run every model against it. And then what's the cost to actually just do the full run against that benchmark? And I think that's one of the best apples to apples comparisons. So to run their full benchmark set of tests for Fable 5 costs $5,455 with Claude Fable 5. Compare that to GPT 5.6 Sol on max setting, $2,016. So again, almost a third of the cost, well under half of the cost. So it's pretty interesting seeing like what these different things translate to into actual real usage. So definitely something you want to factor in there. All right. Yeah, super interesting. I think any other final thoughts that business leaders, IT directors, CIOs need to keep in mind when they're looking at like, okay, what do I need to think of when I'm comparing these platforms and models in terms of foundation models to build my agentic platform on?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately what you need to figure out is what your overall usage is going to be, right? There are subscription models for OpenAI. If you're going above that subscription model, you might need to think, okay, should I calculate what my usage looks like at a cost basis for paying for a pool of tokens? Or am I going to fall within a comfortable window of one of the Anthropic plans when you're looking at the two vendors? I think if you're somebody who likes predictable cost and your team is small enough and your usage isn't absolutely through the roof, you're not using it for heavy app development with 10 people daily nonstop, then I think you're probably going to lean towards the Anthropic subscription models. But if you're somebody who's got a really big team and your usage is very variable, then you might be just looking at OpenAI's models and investing in a pool, and you're overall going to see more efficiency and a lower price.
I got a question for you guys. Let me see if I'm thinking about this right. This feels like a pretty strong case to go back and talk about why an AI agent and having plugins might help. This is an awful lot of levers for any one person to look at or keep track of. So if I've got a team of 10 people doing a myriad of tasks, a lot of commonality amongst the team, them thinking to switch the model based on what task they're doing, that's a lot to juggle on top of just doing the task in and of itself. Can you build into the model or into your plugin, when I'm doing this particular skill, use this particular model? And that way across the board, if people are leveraging those same skills, we can make sure we're using the most appropriate model, controlling your cost as best you can. I know it's a moving target and the formula's changing all the time, but is there truth to that logic?
So when it comes to plugins, like if you're talking about leveraging plugins for skills, sharing agents, etc., you can control the model selection at multiple levels. You can control it at the skill level. You could control it at the sub-agent level. So by leveraging plugins, yes, you can add more specific controls by predetermining what skills or types of tasks should use what models. In your admin settings as well for your accounts with OpenAI or Anthropic, in the workspace admin settings, you can go and control what models people can access as well. So you can really work to simplify the amount of decisions that people have to make through, yes, plugins is one avenue, your admin settings being another avenue. And so you got a couple different levers there as you're rolling out to your user base.
Yeah, and it goes all the way back to exactly what you're talking about, Greg. When you talk about having a common practice or a common procedure for working with these AI tools, if you're able to roll this out to the team, you have control over what models are utilized, and really you have more control over what your credit usage is. And even to the point where, hey, if you're leveraging Anthropic's higher tier of a plan, then maybe you want to look at adding more context to take advantage of that, right? Maybe you're falling under where your benchmark should be for utilizing tokens based off of what you're paying for. So it can go both ways, and you can see higher quality, slower times, or you can go lower quality, faster times, lower token cost, if that's what you're looking for.
Understood. I just think it's a pretty big gamble to just throw it out to your team, tell them to figure it out, right? So as a business leader, somebody's trying to do a budget and plan, there's a lot of things you can do, and you want to make sure you're considering all these levers to put a good plan in place for your business to control costs as best you can. So any closing thoughts on this?
I just think it's, this is such a foundational decision. It really underpins everything else, but it's something that can get lost sometimes because you start looking at agent frameworks and context management and memory and all this other stuff. And at the end of the day, they all have a model underneath it that's driving dollars being spent. So it's really got to be at the foundation of every decision that you make as you build out your agentic architecture.
Yeah, I'm trying to apply these lessons as I learn them. And I think back to one of Gavin's earliest topics about you really need to define what your process is. Yeah, I can book a Concorde to fly from Atlanta to Tampa and be there in 74 seconds probably, but it's not the most economical way to get there. So we're all going to want to default to the fastest thing, but that doesn't necessarily translate when it comes to operational cost of it. So a lot of great lessons here. There is an artifact for anybody who's keeping notes of what Gavin said. There's a lot of numbers that he threw out there. So we have an artifact as usual to go with this episode that breaks down visually how you compare model by model, family by family. So Gavin, thanks again for pulling that together. We'll put those in the show notes. If you've got questions, comments, a topic you want us to cover, reach out to SiriusTalk@SiriusSolutions.com. Really glad to have Tim and Gavin back here today. Appreciate your time, gentlemen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, that's a wrap for today's episode of Serious Talk Agentic AI. A sincere thank you to Tim Harding and Gavin Franklin. Gavin walked us tier by tier through both models, from Haiku and Luna all the way up to Fable 5 and Sol Ultra. And he built the comparison artifact that goes with this episode. Tim brought the cost per task benchmarks and turned printed token prices into real-world numbers. That's the homework that makes a conversation like this usable. Tim said it plainly, every agent framework, every context strategy, every memory system runs on a model underneath that is driving dollars being spent, and that decision belongs at the foundation of your agentic architecture. If this episode helped you think through your own model and subscription decisions, subscribe wherever you listen and leave us a review. It genuinely helps others find the show. Gavin's model-by-model comparison artifact is linked in the show notes, along with everything else we referenced today. As always, a special thanks goes out to Jason Fowler for allowing use of his song, Mystery Road. If you have any questions, comments, or a topic you want us to cover, reach out at SiriusTalk@SiriusSolutions.com. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you on the next one.